Kia ora everyone, welcome back to the Handmaid's Tale unit. Today I will be talking a bit more about the theme of language and power, and so that's sort of a continuation of where we left off last time. And so the discussion really will go into language, culture, and then also how language is a vehicle to basically express power. So we use language every day, and so that may be spoken language or written language or our body language, facial expressions. We communicate with our hands or heads, with our bodies, and also obviously with our words. And so we sort of assume that it's relatively neutral and kind of an organic concept, but it really is not. And so there are all sorts of social and cultural power structures and struggles tied up in the language, and so depending on the context, certain words may mean certain things, and they may mean something different in a different context. And so in many ways language is actually a really powerful mechanism or instrument for gaining and then retaining power. So for example, in the last video we talked a little bit about the difference between you as a teenager and us as teachers and parents. And so the definition of adulthood really has got something to do with that. So there is a clear difference between adults and children, and so there's also a power difference in that. The term adult really holds the power over the term child, and so anybody who embodies the term child will always be assumed to have less power than anyone who embodies the term adult. Now we can argue about why that is the case, whether that's sensible or not. That's sort of a different question. The fact is that within society that is kind of an accepted norm, and that's an accepted power structure which is encoded in our language. So in that sense, language really is a mechanism to sustaining that status and sustaining that sort of power difference. So in class, you might have had a chat about the term woman and how that is played out. So when we look at the word woman and its origin, tracing back to basically being a wife, and then being the wife of a man, and then turning into woman, that obviously is a word history that has defined the position of women in relation to men for quite a long time, particularly in the very patriarchal structures that Western societies seem to find themselves in. And so the language really helps here to sustain the status quo of men's power over women. Skip across that. So the question really is, why is language so slippery, and why is it so difficult to nail down what we really mean? And so one of the things that we need to be aware of is that is a linguistic problem, and so a problem with sort of the science of language. There are lots of theories around that, and so we could look into those theories. And in the last video I already spoke a little bit about Ferdinand de Saussure and how he explained the signifier and the signified not having anything to do with each other. So the tree itself has got no relationship whatsoever to the word tree. But the fact that language is so complicated and so hard to basically nail down and get exactly right is also the reason why we sometimes struggle to know how to say what we want to say in an essay or a conversation. Say you might want to have a conversation with one of your friends, or have a breakup conversation, which tend to be quite tricky to find the right words for those ones. So language isn't the easiest thing to have full control of. If you look at this collection of words, you will see that language really works on a system of difference. And so to be able to define one term, you have to have another one that's slightly different. And so each one of the words that we have kind of distinguish one thing from another thing. It's really difficult to have a word, actually our language can't do that, just have one word and then a really clear meaning, because the definition is always going to be kind of a comparison to something else that it's not quite but close to. And so if you look at this development of essentially like a housing type of object, you might go from a hovel to a shack to an apartment, a villa, a mansion, a palace. And so all of these have got something in common, but they also are significantly different from each other. And so the words help us express what exactly we mean, what exact type of building or type of housing we are referring to. But in that context, we understand that they are very different. And so depending on which one of those words we use, we might make some, or you might read about somebody living in a shack, and you might make some assumptions about that person. You might read about somebody living in a mansion or a palace, and you probably might make very different assumptions about that person, their social status, their wealth, and all sorts of other related things. And that's purely down to the language that we choose to use. So really what we're trying to do is point out something that is really fundamental, but something that we don't think about very often. And so that is that our words are essentially empty vessels. They don't have any inbuilt meaning, so they are not at all connected to the thing that they're describing. They only gain meaning in the context that we use them. And so there's nothing really about CAT or cat that's got anything to do with a cat, with a cute or not so cute, depending on what you think of cats, ball of fur that goes by that name. There's really no relationship between that and the pure collection or the sound of those letters. And so if you look at where else those letters of cat, what other words it's in, like it's in cart and cast and can't and scat. And so there isn't anything within those words that actually suggests cat. It's just what we have come to associate with that word. And so that is sort of the tricky bit here, that we have learned all of those concepts, those ideas, those things. And there's nothing inherently cat-like about the word cat. And so if the language is empty, that means we can fill it with meaning, which also means we can start manipulating people based on how we interpret language. And so some particular words are quite hotly contested, whether we can use a word like that or whether we can't, because some of those words and phrases really sustain a particular power status of a particular group, whereas others might actually prompt change. And so language can be very powerful in that way. So when you think about the term marriage, and I've sort of touched on that before, and the same with the term equality, like why do you think that there's so much argument, I guess, and so much contestation around what those terms mean? So who's included in marriage and who's perhaps not included, who's perhaps excluded? When we talk about equality, what do we actually mean? And perhaps are we looking for equity more than equality? What's the difference between those two terms? Who gets to define them? Who's asking for equality, and what kind of equality do they actually want? What's the perspective that you're speaking from? So there are a lot of questions around those terms, and so it really pays for you to think about them. What's your definition of marriage, and what do you picture? Is for you, is same-sex marriage part of the marriage definition, or is it a separate one? When we talk about equality, which groups of people do you think about? And so is it equality of gender? Is it equality of class? Is it equality of races? So what's your concept in your imagination doing when you read those words, and therefore how do you interpret them? So those two terms are good examples of why there's so much controversy, and so depending on the context they have very different meaning, and also depending on the person who says them or listens to them, the interpretation will be very different. But the way that you interpret both of those terms actually makes a difference to your lives, and so that's kind of the key element here. Like the words themselves are empty, but the meaning that we fill them with make real differences in our real life. And so one of the things when we look at equality, here's an example, is that currently in many countries only men can be forced into military service during times of war, and so would true equality then mean that women should be equally forced to serve? Yes or no? And there's, there are other examples like that, where particular groups of people will be expected to do particular things, whereas others are not. And so it's worthwhile exploring how much language contributes to those. There's a little bit of discussion here that would be useful to have, and so perhaps you can think about that. Have a think about why women are never referred to as women in The Handmaid's Tale. Instead, they are referred to as handmaids or wives or Marthas or whatever else. Why is that such a powerful mechanism to basically separate all women out into different groups rather than referring to them collectively as women? So why is that a really powerful mechanism for sustaining that power and that control over women, dividing them up into those different groups? Right, so as we wrap it up, what's really important to remember is that for both Edward and Offred, words really matter, and they have a really significant impact on how the world works for them. So I've had this, given you this example earlier, that Offred talks about not wanting to tempt someone with friendship, which is not something that we would use. Like, we don't think about temptation when we are beginning a friendship with someone. In her political regime, in the environment that she lives in, that is in fact a temptation and something that is forbidden. And so there are very subtle shifts to language, and so Offred experiences that when there's a shift from being called a woman to being called a handmaid, and so it's significant enough to really reduce the power that she has and the freedom that she has, and so she has got actually no chance to be part of making the definition of who she is. And so the question is, what's the bigger point? And I guess what we have to keep in mind is that those who have power determine the meaning of the words that we get exposed to. And so we need to pay attention to our authorities and the systems and the regime that we are perhaps exposed to, and see how they use language to shape the social landscape or the landscape of society, and therefore have an impact on how we perceive people, and how the power structures will eventually work out. So any reallocation of meaning or reinterpretation may contribute to making things better for us, or it may contribute to decreasing our freedom. And so we need to be paying attention to who gets to define the words. And so I guess what we see in The Handmaid's Tale is that there's a regime of only white middle class, strongly religious men controlling their government, and so their interpretations of the Bible go completely unchecked because they've worked themselves into such a powerful position that nobody dares to question their interpretation. And so the whole system is basically based on disempowering women, which works largely by changes in language and changes in the interpretation of terms. And so, as you're going through your day-to-day life, pay attention to the words people are using with you, because language is largely used for manipulation, in the positive and negative way. And so think about the context that you use your language in, and what the impact is on others. All right. lots of information for you around language and power. And so hopefully you will have lots to say about that now. All right, guys, take care, and I'll be in touch later. Bye.